leadership. And I could give you several more, but let me just show you this one. This is my favorite, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which says basically that nobody who's elected to office and swears an oath to support or defend and uphold the Constitution, who violates that oath because they've engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution, shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. So how is it possible that all of my colleagues are saying that the meaning of the Second Amendment is you've got a right to overthrow the government if you think it's acting tyrannically, and yet that's the explicit reason for barring people from ever holding federal or state office again? Now, against all of this authority, they read in invisible ink a provision into the Second Amendment, which simply says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-regulated militia. Well, what does that mean? Look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16. Congress shall have power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So, no, the Proud Boys are not the militia. The Oath Keepers are not the militia. The Ku Klux Klan is not the militia. The militia is a well-regulated militia, which the Supreme Court has repeatedly said means well-regulated by the government. So I think this is the central mythology and fraudulent dogma of the NRA and today the GOP, which needs to be exploded. The reason that they say we can't have a universal violent criminal background check endorsed by 90% of the American people, the reason why we can't have a ban on AR-15 assault weapons used against our people in schools and Walmarts and churches and grocery stores is because they've got a right to overthrow the government. No, you don't have a right to overthrow the government in America. And when I point this out to them, and my colleagues have seen this in the Oversight Committee or the Judiciary Committee, they only have two things to say. One, they say, well, Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death, which was a great slogan during the American Revolution. It's not in the Constitution, of course. And in any event, Patrick Henry was an anti-federalist who voted against the Constitution. So why should we turn to him to interpret the meaning of all of these provisions in the Constitution? And then they say, finally, and this has more surface plausibility, well, what about the American Revolution itself, the Declaration of Independence, which says, when in the course of human events the government turns tyrannical, and you've got a power to break away from it. Absolutely right, you do. Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, but he didn't cite the British Constitution or the Magna Carta for that. He invoked natural law. Everybody has under natural law a natural right to rebel against tyrants and oppressors. But if you think, for example, the 2020 presidential election was an exercise in tyranny, like what King George and the Parliament were doing against the colonists, and you want to overthrow the government, well, you've got the natural right to try and do it. But if our officers, through their bravery, and our leaders are able to stop you, then you're going to be arrested and you're going to be prosecuted. And like Stuart Rhodes, the Yale Law School graduate, head of the Oath Keepers, you're going to go to jail for 19 years because you don't have a right under our Constitution to overthrow our Constitution. If you think you want to step outside the Constitution and the rule of law and try and do it, well, you can try and do that, but at that point you're setting yourself at war against the Constitution. So this is all about us restoring the rule of law in America. And now I yield to my friend, the great Maxwell Frost from Florida, who's been organizing around this for a long time. Mr. Frost, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ranking Member. Good afternoon. I want to thank our incredible panel who have come from all across the country to be here with us, and thank you to our audience. I'm looking forward to hearing your critical insight into the current state of gun violence in America and the path that we need to go towards to prevent gun violence. This issue is very near and dear to me. As was mentioned, I've spent most of my life fighting to end gun violence. It was the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012 that pushed me to become an advocate in the first place. And learning the stories and coming up for that vigil really changed 15-year-old Maxwell Frost's life, and really presented me with a call to action that I then answered. After that, I got involved in politics, but it was all because of gun violence prevention. In 2021, gun violence surpassed car accidents as the leading cause of death for children, being responsible for 1 in 5 child deaths. And this isn't just about mass shootings. I always like to tell people, think about all the carnage. Think about all the media. Think about all the trauma and stories that mass shootings bring. And then know the fact that mass shootings account for 1% of gun violence. I don't say that to diminish mass shootings. I say that so people can really recognize how huge this issue is and how many lives it takes on a daily basis. And the other number that we don't often talk about is the people who are shot who then survive, and then the people who are surviving on a daily basis in their community with daily gun violence and community gun violence that we see that predominantly impacts black and brown folks. Black trans women and LGBTQ plus people also being disproportionately impacted by gun violence. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, London Price, a black trans woman in my state of Florida, was pistol whipped and shot to death in front of her grandmother in South Florida. Not a peep from the governor, not a peep from state legislators who claim to fight for all Floridians. Recently, back in March, I introduced my first bill, which was to create a federal office of gun violence prevention. Something that I actually had been fighting for long before I got to Congress when I was a national organizing director at March for Our Lives. This was a call to action of the administration and of Congress given by the movement over the last 3 to 4 years. And it meant a world when the White House took that bill and made it, implemented it via executive order. And now, for the first time in our country's history, we have a federal office of gun violence prevention. Staffed, and the staff is really important here because you can make an office and staff it with a bunch of hacks who don't know what they're doing, but the president didn't do that. He put in charge Greg Jackson and Rob Wilcox, 2 survivors of gun violence who have been doing this work for a long time, and led by Stephanie Feldman, who's been advocating for this work from within the White House. And they're working alongside gun violence prevention advocates, leaders from across the country, and I'm really excited to see the work that they do. And that win is because of the movement that had been fighting for it for upwards of about 4 years on that very specific ask. And it's not a coincidence that just a week and a half after that office came to be, my district in the city of Orlando received a check of $1.5 million from the Department of Justice Community Violence Intervention Initiative. And we're not done. We're going to get a lot more money. But the reason why this money has been dispersed in such a quick way is because of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention that is advocating and fighting for the speedy implementation of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That was also a result of the tireless work of advocates and people who have been fighting for it within the organizations and movement. They also got right to work on the third mission and one of the most important missions of the office, which is to act like a FEMA, to go and respond when gun violence strikes a community. We saw them in the ground in Maine to support survivors and advocates there. In fact, it was just last week that a colleague of mine, Marjorie Taylor Greene, put in an amendment to defund the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. One that kind of skirted past the media. A lot of people don't know about this. We voted on this amendment on the floor. And it worried me because I thought they would have a good chance of defunding this office. But we got right to work, speaking with Republicans, speaking with Democrats that don't often vote the way we want them to vote on this issue. And in a bipartisan way, we defeated that amendment with 8 Republicans who voted against it, which I think shows that there is a light at the end of the tunnel with this issue. The gun lobby is more afraid now more than ever as they see a multiracial, multi-generational army of Americans who are not going to relent on the demands for common sense gun reform. And we got to be clear, organizations like the NRA and like organizations that say that they are an advocacy group for gun owners it's a bunch of BS. They're not an advocacy group. They're fronts for the gun lobby. And this issue, much like many other issues, in part, we don't see good work on in the federal government because of corporate greed being valued over the lives of people and humans. And gun violence prevention is not any different in that retrospect. As our communities once again reel from the senseless loss of life in Maine and even more senseless void of congressional action, it is critical that we hear from survivors and leaders in the gun violence prevention movement to discuss a coordinated response to these tragedies. Our communities, the innocent victims, and the families who have lost loved ones deserve more than our thoughts and prayers. They deserve our commitment to a path forward in a world without gun violence, looking at the issue holistically, from school shootings to mass shootings, to shootings that happen in our community, to shootings by police officers, where if you are a black teenage male, the most likely cause of death for you is to be shot and killed by the police. This is all gun violence, and we have to attack this issue in a holistic way. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Frost, for your thoughtful opening remarks there. The title of our roundtable today is Thoughts and Prayers with Actions and Change, Practical Solutions to End Gun Slaughter in America, Part 1. I want to, just before I introduce our speakers today, I wanted to just echo something Congressman Frost said. There are lots of terrible anti-gun safety provisions that are being slipped into legislation all the time. This week we're going to be voting on the Commerce, Justice, and Science funding bill, which includes provisions that would block funds for gun buyback programs, that would bar the implementation of any regulations or guidance that have been issued by the Biden administration to reduce gun violence. It would forbid the implementation, enforcement, and legal defense of the ATF's frame or receiver firearm rule, which is aimed at regulating ghost guns. So thank you, Maxwell, for reminding us we've got to be on our guard as a lot of these pro-NRA provisions are being slipped into legislation this week. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. First, we're going to hear from Mariah Cooley, a recent Howard University graduate and current board member at the National Youth Movement March for Our Lives, where Congressman Frost worked. Next, we'll hear from James or J.T. Timpson, the Managing Director of Community Violence Initiatives at the Roca Impact Institute, a community violence intervention group working in Baltimore, my home state of Maryland. Then we're going to hear from Kelly Sampson, Senior Counsel and Director of Racial Justice at the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Then we're going to hear from Professor Joseph Blocher, law professor and Associate Dean of Faculty and Research at Duke University. And our final panelist is Michelle Kefford, the principal of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School and a member of the National Association of Secondary School Principals Principal Recovery Network, which is a consortium of principals who have been through the nightmare of gun violence, who've gotten together to help each other through it, and Michelle's going to describe that to us. I'm asking each panelist to limit your opening remarks to 5 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for exchange and dialogue with Congresswoman Norton and Congressman Frost and other members who are able to join us as they get back to Washington. With that, Ms. Cooley, you are now recognized for the purposes of making your opening statement.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Mariah Cooley, and I'm 22 years old and a recent graduate of Howard University. I'm the Midwest Advocacy Associate for Community Justice, the only Black-led gun violence prevention group in the country, and I serve on the board for March for Our Lives. Thank you for inviting me and for hosting this conversation. I know I'm here to answer your questions, but let me be first to ask you some. When will the death count be high enough? When will I be able to walk to the park or to the movies without fear or anxiety? When will young people's constitutional right to safety and a future free of gun violence be respected? And when will enough be enough until we do something, until we do everything to end this epidemic? These are the questions that keep me up at night, and I hope you can say the same. Because right now, America has a problem and not enough is being done about it. From Monterey Park and Enoch City to Nashville and now Lewistown, gun violence has touched communities across the country, and every day, more and more people learn what the American nightmare is. Growing up in Peoria, Illinois, which had one of the highest murder rates per capita in the country a few years ago, I lost a peer due to gun violence when I was just 13 years old, and only a few years later, when I was 16, I lost my cousin. It's hard to believe that one person could experience this much loss before the age of 18, but this is a devastating reality for far too many young people and far too many young people of color. As I'm sure you all know, guns have been the leading cause of death for children and teens for the past 3 years, surpassing car accidents and even cancer. And it shows no sign of slowing down. 2023 has become the second worst year for mass killings, and the year's not even over yet. What we don't talk about enough, though, is the disproportionate effect on gun violence has on young people of color. In 2022, Black children and teens were 20 times as likely to die by guns compared to white counterparts, and for the first time on record, the gun suicide rate among Black children and teens surpassed the rate amongst white children and teens. These stats show exactly how I see gun violence, through my age and through the color of my skin. Too often, the narrative only centers around mass shootings, especially those impacting mostly white communities. But what moved me to action are the daily incidents of gun violence that disproportionately happen in low-income, marginalized groups, and often Black communities and other communities of color. And sometimes it's at the hands of the very people who are supposed to be protecting us, the police. At March for Our Lives, we know that this is an intersectional issue that is rooted in racism and economic marginalization, things that can and should be addressed long before someone picks up a gun. This is why we focus on the 5 forces that fuel gun violence in our country: gun glorification, armed supremacy, political apathy and corruption, poverty, and the national mental health crisis. We advocate for proactive solutions that address these root causes, solutions like community violence intervention programs that serve as a vital way to connect community resources to those who need them most, addressing gun violence in a holistic way. We cannot continue this cycle of waiting for another shooting to happen until we act. Imagine if Representative Jared Golden fought for gun violence prevention before the mass shooting in his district. Now, ask yourself, what are you doing and what are your colleagues doing to prevent these type of same tragedies from happening in your own communities? And if you think it can't happen in your own community, ask Congressman Goldman his thoughts. Overall, we need to be more proactive and we need to act now. Studies show that as gun laws have become looser in the past 7 years, gun deaths and mass shootings have increased over the same period. This isn't hard math, it's super easy to understand. And I'm thankful for your work. It's clear more work needs to be done at the federal level. And we can do more. I mean, just look at how far March for Our Lives has come. Since our founding in 2018, we've passed over 300 laws nationwide, including the bipartisan Safer's Community Act and our work that led to the creation of the first ever Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We've become the largest youth movement in the nation and have driven youth voter turnout to record highs. And we've changed the narrative of gun violence from being a third rail issue pushed under the bed to an issue that is winning elections. But this is simply the floor and not the ceiling. Out of those 300 laws we've helped pass, I can count on one hand the amount that have been at the federal level. So we need your help. Because our lives are under constant threat, whether we're at school, the movie theater, a football game, the grocery store, or even within our own homes. We, the mass shooting generation, know this epidemic better than anyone, and we also have the solutions to solve it. We just need our leaders to give us a seat at the table and to listen and to take action. Thank you for giving me that seat today, and I hope that this conversation will be the first of many where young people's voices are not only being heard, but taken seriously, because I shouldn't be numb from losing people to gun violence, and neither should you.
Thank you, Ms. Cooley, for your excellent presentation. I also want to recognize a bunch of March for Our Lives young people who've joined us in the audience today. Mr. Timpson, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Raskin, Representative Morton, Representative Frost. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is James Timpson. I'm the Managing Director for CVI for the Roca Impact Institute, co-founding director of the Roca Direct Service in Baltimore, Maryland. Roca is a community-based violence intervention program. We're really more like a behavioral change model that lives kind of within the community violence intervention field. We serve the highest risk young people at the center of urban violence. And what I mean by the highest risk young people, we serve the young people that are most likely to be your next victims or perpetrators of gun violence. In Baltimore, we service a population of young men that are highly traumatized, that reach a level of decision making that we often question and wonder why when we see the behaviors that are exhibited. But one thing we must understand is that it takes time for us to reach these young people. So our focus is through our relentless street outreach. We track down our young people, whether they voluntarily decide to be a part of our program or whether they don't. We get a name, an address, and we go find the young people because we know that they deserve and need this opportunity for change. We build deep relationships with these young people to really help them focus on making better decisions. And the way that we do that is we do it by skill building. We offer them a tool that helps address their trauma, that helps them make better decisions over time period. That tool that we use is CBT, our Rewired CBT. It's our own iteration or form of cognitive behavioral theory that was designed to be taught by non-clinicians and frontline workers, those who have the most contact with the young people every day in the streets. To disrupt violence, we must heal trauma, the trauma our young people experience, the trauma our frontline violence workers experience, and the trauma our communities experience due to gun violence. This never became more real for me until 2018 when my best friend and mentor in this work was murdered doing the work. At that point in time, I had been professionalizing doing this work for about 15, 16 years already, working in the streets of Baltimore, and I thought that my trauma was healed until that death or that murder hit my front door. It was one of the toughest periods of my life to actually have to manage my own trauma as well as to continue to manage the trauma of the people that we were serving in the community. But fortunately, I remembered the tools that were in my toolkit to help me really be able to address my trauma without going back to what most of our young people most commonly used to, resolving gun violence with gun violence. It's possible to heal this trauma, but we know that the change takes time. Our young people have to learn to take an 8 to 12 second pause between what they think, what they feel, and what they actually do to have an opportunity to do something different. So part of this CBT intervention has had an unintentional dual purpose. It's a tool that we teach community to work with young people to help young people make better decisions. But what we find is that it also addresses the trauma of the workers actually doing the work, I being one of those. It's replicable and it's scalable, but it actually takes time. What we need is support and the resources to actually make these intervention programs longer. It doesn't take young people 16 years, it doesn't take young people, 6 months to get to the way that they are. It takes them 16 years, 18 years, 12 years, however old they are. So we need intervention programs that are longer, that give us longer periods of time to work with young people, not just 6 or 12-month funding cycles. We really need to be able to address the behavior change, which science tells us through our through our study of brain science, which tells us it takes at least 18 to 24 months before we start seeing sustained behavior change in young people. We know that this process is actually scalable, it's realistic, and it actually works. If you speak to individuals and organizations across the country who are doing this work to disrupt violence, they will all tell you that they're dealing with a workforce that's extremely traumatized, who have to show up every day and relive different accounts of vicarious trauma every day. We work in communities that we're from. We work in communities that we live in. So most of the time, those murders that we see and hear reported on TV are people that we know. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sampson, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Ranking Member Raskin and distinguished representatives, thank you for inviting me today. I'm Kelly Sampson, Senior Counsel and Director of Racial Justice at Brady, an organization uniting Americans to take action against gun violence. I've been asked to discuss the epidemic of gun violence, why and how it persists, as well as federal solutions. Less than 2 weeks ago, we observed Halloween, a time to celebrate scary stories about imaginary monsters and spirits. But the very real threat of gun violence haunts us every day. Survivors are haunted by physical pain and trauma. Family members are haunted by empty chairs and grief. Kindergartners are haunted by lockdown drills. And everyone who is paying attention is haunted by living with an epidemic that kills over 40,000 people a year and is the #1 killer of our children. Americans are trapped in a real-life horror movie that Congress has the power to fix, yet it continues to play on a loop. Why? First, the gun industry constantly obstructs the common-sense gun regulations that Americans overwhelmingly want. For example, almost all Americans, including 80% of Republicans, support universal background checks, making it one of the most popular policies in American politics, and with good reason. Without universal background checks, guns will continue to flow from states with weaker laws to states with stronger ones. Consider Maryland, which has universal background checks, and Florida, which doesn't. 65% of all guns traced to crime in Florida come from inside the state, while almost 70% of guns recovered in Maryland come from outside. This shows how important it is for federal action to prevent the unlawful diversion of firearms. The Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2023 would do just that, expanding Brady background checks to cover all gun sales. And universal background checks' popularity isn't an aberration. In fact, many gun violence prevention measures are overwhelmingly popular. So why don't we have them? Well, undemocratic systems allow a minority to stonewall legislation, suppress votes, and throw dark money into elections. This is especially chilling because the very same constituencies most impacted by gun violence are also most impacted by anti-democratic policies. Voter suppression, for example, disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. So does gun violence. Black Americans are over 4 times more likely to be killed by a gun than the overall population, and 12 times more likely to be killed by a gun than a white person. That's why it's particularly sinister that anti-democratic policies allow Congress to deny Black and brown communities life-saving laws. Special interests shouldn't undermine the people's will, especially when those special interests profit from bloodshed. Congress should immediately take up legislation such as the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to ensure equal access to the ballot box, equal representation, and keep dark money from drowning out American voters' voices. Doing so is critical for us to address the generational cycles of poverty and violence in many Black and brown communities. To end this community violence, we need a 2-pronged approach. We need to address the root causes of violence, or what we call the demand side, with legislation such as the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, which funds evidence-informed community violence intervention programs. We also need to address the unfettered flow of guns into impacted communities, or supply side, or effects that violence intervention will be unable to overcome the readily available supply of guns. To do this, we need to pass legislation such as the Firearms Retailer Code of Conduct Act to create strong standards for firearms dealers and hold negligent and irresponsible actors in the industry accountable. Speaking of the industry, it makes money by marketing fear. Their big lie is that more guns make us safer. They're convincing people that the biggest threats are external, even though the presence of a firearm is much more likely to result in self-harm than it is to ever be used in self-defense. This is evident as suicide accounted for over half of the approximately 45,000 annual gun deaths. The high rate of gun suicide is why extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOs, are critical. ERPOs provide a means to temporarily remove firearms from people who are a threat to themselves or others while ensuring ample due process protections. Of course, the gun industry's fear-mongering doesn't just induce people to buy guns, but to buy ever more lethal ones. Assault weapons paired with high-capacity magazines have but one purpose: to kill as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. The assault weapons ban would address this and reduce the lethality of mass shootings. In the past, the House has passed life-saving gun violence prevention bills, only to be stymied by a minority of senators empowered by the filibuster. However, it's current House leadership who refuses to bring these bills to the floor. We know that strong gun laws save lives, and that without federal action, states with strong laws will be at the mercy of states without them. House leadership must act and allow members to vote on these critical policies. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your fine opening statement. And now, Professor Blocher, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Raskin, members of the committee, for allowing me to speak here with you today. My name is Joseph Blocher. I am the Lanty L. Smith Distinguished Professor of Law and Senior Associate Dean at Duke Law School, where I'm also the faculty co-director of the Center for Firearms Law. The subtitle of today's roundtable discussion is Practical Solutions to End Gun Slaughter in America. And those solutions, like all government action, must of course comply with the Constitution, including the Second Amendment. Proper interpretation of the Second Amendment permits the kinds of reasonable gun regulation that the vast majority of Americans favor, but recent Supreme Court holdings have thrust judges and their readings of history and tradition into a much more prominent role. Just last week, the justices heard oral argument in a case called United States versus Rahimi, which tests the constitutionality of the current federal law prohibiting gun possession by people subject to certain domestic violence restraining orders. That law was adopted in 1994 in response to the undeniable link between intimate partner violence and guns. Today, nearly half of all women murdered in the United States are killed by a current or former intimate partner, and more than half of those intimate partner homicides are by gun. Women are 5 times more likely to be murdered by an abusive partner if that partner has access to a gun. But, according to the Supreme Court's 2022 decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the constitutionality of modern firearms regulations does not depend on whether they are properly tailored to prevent that kind of death and coercion, but rather on whether they are, in the court's words, consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. This novel historical analogical approach is currently the governing test for Second Amendment cases, and I want to make 3 quick points about it. First, legislatures have acted to protect the public peace from weapons threats since long before the founding. Historians have written volumes on this topic, and the Duke Center for Firearms Law hosts an online repository containing more than 2,000 illustrative weapons regulations throughout history. Gun regulation is not a modern innovation, even though its forms, of course, have changed. Second, reasoning from history does not mean repeating it. Both Bruin and the court's earlier decision in District of Columbia versus Heller are rooted in history, but they specifically authorize modern forms of gun regulation. Justice Scalia's majority opinion in Heller endorses a common law tradition that has long authorized laws protecting the public peace against weapons threats. As Chief Justice Roberts put it at oral argument in Heller, quote, "We are talking about lineal descendants of the arms, but presumably there are lineal descendants of the restrictions as well." And even Bruin specifically contemplates change in forms of regulation over time. And yet, Bruin's historical test is still deeply problematic and has caused serious disruption and confusion in the lower courts. Quite simply, it is hard to draw meaningful connections between modern gun laws and their historic predecessors, given the enormous changes in both weapons technology and society more broadly. Is the current prohibition on guns in the metro relevantly similar to medieval weapons restrictions in fairs and markets? Is the modern AR-15 relevantly similar to a black powder musket? Or for that matter, are domestic abusers relevantly similar to the groups that were disarmed at the founding? Answering those questions involves a great deal of judicial discretion, as we have seen some judges require regulation closely to resemble laws of the distant past, even as they define the scope of the right expansively so as to protect weapons whose lethality the framers could not possibly have imagined. And that brings us back to Rahimi, where a panel of judges on the Fifth Circuit struck down the domestic violence restraining order law, calling it an outlier that the framers never would have accepted, and distinguishing away a number of historical laws as being insufficiently similar to support it. This was a flawed answer to the wrong question. There is sufficient historical evidence to support the modern domestic violence prohibitor, and what the Constitution requires, even after Bruin, is not that modern gun laws have historical twins, but that they are consistent with the Constitution's enduring principles. As to those enduring principles, one appellate judge put it well years ago: history is consistent with common sense. It demonstrates that legislatures have the power to prohibit dangerous people from possessing guns. Those words were written by then-Judge Amy Coney Barrett. As the Supreme Court considers Rahimi, we must hope that it will reaffirm the connection between history and common sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you kindly, Professor Blocher, for your presentation. Really appreciate that. And Mrs. Keffert, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon, honorable members of this committee, and thank you for inviting me here today. I would like to thank Ranking Member Raskin for the invitation to participate in this important discussion to take action in preventing gun violence in our American communities, and his attention to the urgent and immediate need to protect our K-12 schools and aid the recovery for those who have unfortunately already suffered tragic shootings. I would also like to thank my Congressman, Jared Moskowitz, as well as another fellow Floridian, Congressman Maxwell Frost, for your leadership on gun violence prevention and recovery. My name is Michelle Kefford, and I'm the proud principal of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Stoneman Douglas is a very special place for me, not only because I have the privilege of leading the school, but because I started my career there almost 25 years ago as a biology teacher, where I served students for 6 years. Both of my children are Stoneman Douglas Eagles. One was a member of the graduating class of 2022, and one is a current sophomore. After the horrific mass shooting that occurred on our campus in 2018, I was asked to come back home to Stoneman Douglas and lead the school in its continuous recovery efforts that are still very real and active today. I think it's important for you to know that in addition to being Stoneman Douglas's principal, I am also a Parkland resident. As a Parkland resident, I experienced this tragedy with my community members and my neighbors, but I also experienced this tragedy as a parent. As a mother who received a panicked call from her then 8th grade student that there was a code red at school and it was not a drill. My son was in a portable classroom on February 14th, 2018, just steps away from where 17 were tragically murdered and 17 others injured. He was locked in a portable classroom with Stoneman Douglas students who had been pulled in by his teacher to keep them safe. These students had witnessed firsthand the horrific acts of the shooter and described what had happened to my son and others in the classroom. Nothing is more terrifying to a parent than their child being in danger. I can tell you that it's been almost 6 years since the most horrific day in our school's history, and the tragedy still impacts our school community very profoundly, and our recovery efforts are still actively underway. In addition to serving Coral Springs and Parkland as a principal, I am also a former National Association of Secondary School Principals State Principal of the Year, which is NASSP, as well as an NASSP National Principal of the Year finalist, and member of the NASSP Principal Recovery Network. This recovery network, or PRN as we refer to ourselves, is made up of 21 current and former school principals who, like me, suffered a shooting at their school or assumed leadership immediately after a shooting to lead the long and arduous road to recovery. This group was founded by NASSP with the help of Frank DeAngelis, the former principal of Columbine High School. He helped bring this group together to do this work collectively, work that he had done on his own since 1999. The PRN includes principals of Sandy Hook, Chardon, and Aztec, but it also includes principals whose tragedies didn't grab nonstop national media attention for days or weeks. Forest, West Liberty Salem, Harrisburg, Perry Hall. These are just some of our PRN member schools. These schools may not ring in your mind as acutely as Stoneman Douglas or Sandy Hook. However, they represent the hundreds of school shootings that have taken place over the past 2 decades, each one of them leaving an immense amount of trauma on the entire community and neighboring cities. Several PRN members were themselves shot in their tragedies. Still, despite the trauma, this heroic group of leaders provides immediate response and reaches out to every single school that suffers a shooting. They offer advice, guidance, and support to the principal and the district on best practices for recovery. We work closely with the Department of Education to coordinate outreach efforts, as well as with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity, Infrastructure, and Safety Agency to advise on their excellent suite of school safety products and resources. We have produced the PRN Guide to Recovery that we released last August in an event at the Columbine Memorial in Littleton, Colorado. The guide is a collection of best practices based on our lived experience. It's provided to school leaders facing the unimaginable. There is no course in our principal certification programs that instructs us on how to navigate the aftermath of a mass shooting, so we were forced to make our own. Sadly, our work to care for and support our fellow educators, staff, and students has become devastatingly frequent in recent years. Just last year, there were at least 183 incidents of gunfire on school grounds in this country, resulting in 66 deaths and 158 injuries. That is an average of a school shooting every other day. Let me repeat that, every other day. And with so many shootings, there is simply not enough state or federal recovery funding and resources to go around for all of these shattered schools. If safety in schools is not prioritized, how will educators remain in our profession, especially during a growing crisis where there's an educator shortage? How will students focus on learning if they don't feel safe? We've been blessed at Stoneman Douglas to receive tremendous recovery efforts. But it's an unfortunate fact that many of the schools that don't receive the same level of attention in the aftermath of a tragedy also don't receive the same level of support. That is something members of Congress have the power to change by appropriating more funding to existing federal programs like Project SERVE, which stands for School Emergency Response to Violence. This is a critical lifeline to schools that have endured these tragedies. Project SERVE is funded annually by Congress and administered by the Department of Education. It's designed to provide immediate federal support to help schools recover from violent or traumatic events where the learning environment has been compromised. This can include shootings, but also includes things like natural disasters and other emergencies. Last year, Congress allocated just $5 million towards this program. $5 million for all of the school shootings, all of the hurricanes, all of the wildfires, and all other disasters across this entire country doesn't go very far and will not meet the current or future needs. With the annual federal budget in the trillions, adding modest funding to increase Project SERVE would be less than a drop in the federal bucket, but would make a monumental and targeted difference to schools like mine and my fellow PRN colleagues that have suffered life-altering acts of violence. In addition, solutions like having a permanent school resource officer who is specially trained to work with adolescents and in schools has been critical, not only to the prevention and recovery efforts at my school, but to the need for safety and stability given the impact of ongoing threats, panic, and trauma. Without question, funding to provide each school with a highly trained SRO and a full-time school-based mental health professionals is absolutely necessary. Finally, as you all know too well, Congress is currently engaged in a contentious debate over fiscal year 2024 appropriations funding. While the Senate has put forward a bipartisan funding bill that would maintain current levels of funding for most K-12 education programs, the House has a more dangerous bill on the table, or proposal on the table. That bill proposes an 80% cut to Title I funding, the complete elimination of Title II funding, which supports professional development for educators, and a 28% overall cut to federal education funding. I cannot overstate how devastating cuts like that would be to schools across the country. We rely on those programs to provide an excellent education to all of our students, but they are also integral to the functionality of our school systems and our school safety. Educators and school safety officials are watching closely as this continued debate over funding plays out, and we implore you, please do the right thing for schools, educators, and most importantly, our students. Again, thank you for having me here today. I'm happy to share information on how federal programs like Project SERVE and other funding has benefited our schools' recovery and how we've implemented innovative safety and mental health support for students and staff to make the Stoneman Douglas community whole again. As we continue to focus on violence prevention and recovery years after our tragedy, I look forward to working with members of this committee to help provide the necessary support not only to the schools that have been impacted by gun violence, but to protect all schools. Thank you again for the work you are doing on this committee, and I'm happy to provide answers to your questions.
Thank you, Principal Keffert, and thanks to all 5 of you for excellent presentations. We're going to move to our question and answer period right now, and I'm going to yield to my colleague, Mr. Frost, to kick that off with his 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. The epidemic of gun violence is perhaps the most urgent issue for young Americans. Recently, I had the chance to meet with Assemblywoman Monique Chandler Waterman, and we were discussing approaches to gun violence prevention, including CVI. She spoke of her fight to get everyday gun violence occurrences in black and brown communities recognized by the federal government and the media when they are mass shootings. Ms. Cooley, can you talk a little bit about the biggest gun violence prevention challenges facing communities of color, black and brown communities, and how Community Justice Action Fund and March for Our Lives are working together to address those issues?
Yes, absolutely. As someone who is young and a person of color, I see what the violence looks like every day because that's the environment I grew up in, right? And so what that everyday gun violence looks like is one shooting happens and then a family 9 times out of 10 will want to retaliate because they lost a member, so they, retaliate. And so that's why violence interrupters are so important, because you have mental health professionals, you have CVI groups who go to the site and talk to them about ways that they can heal from this and not continue the repeated cycle. And so I think something that both Community Justice and March for Our Lives do collaboratively is making sure that we are bringing in young people to the table. We're bringing in the boots on the ground organizers to the table and asking them, how can we support you? What initiatives do we need to fight for? And how can we use our connections to talk to legislators to fight for funding to make sure these CVI groups can continue the amazing work that they're doing?
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned something that I think is really important for people to know, especially when it comes down to gun violence in very densely populated areas. Most of the gun violence actually tends to come from the same groups of people. Easily identifiable, easy to create relationship. Not easy, but we can create the relationships. And it should be easy to get the money flowing in the right direction. Can you explain how community violence intervention initiatives work and what it looks like on the ground?
So as I said earlier, when a violent act occurs, you have the violence interrupters who go there on the site to talk to the community members. Like, I do work in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, and there's groups who every day, this is where they've lived all of their life, right? They know these people, they know these streets, they know the targeted groups that tend to have those acts of violence. They speak to them. And then there's also groups that have mental health professional and guidance for afterwards. So when mothers lose their sons, there's groups that will reach out to them, and they have a hotline on the south side of Chicago. So when they need to talk to someone about what they're going through that only a mother could know, those groups are readily available. And so it's groups like that that need funding that don't often make it to the national news, but yet they dedicate their everyday lives to working to end gun violence. And so those are the groups that really need the funding to continue the work that they're doing.
Thank you. Mr. Timpson, Congress has the ability to support community violence intervention in a big way. The city of Orlando started their CVI program with money from the American Rescue Plan over a year ago. And what we've seen is gun violence in the city of Orlando has gone down because of the work that they've been doing. Something that we've encountered, especially recently as I've spoken with our county, our city, and trying to expand CVI, is it seems like there tends to be a butting of heads in my community of law enforcement and CVI. It looks like law enforcement isn't fully sold on the program itself. There's a lot of skepticism there. I'm curious if you've also met that skepticism from law enforcement within your community, if you've overcome it, how you've been able to overcome it, because for me, I see all these things working in tandem to end gun violence. Obviously, we can't arrest ourselves out of this problem.
Sure, absolutely, we've seen it. Baltimore's had a pretty strong history of some law enforcement issues. And, when we first came to Baltimore, I think we went through 4 or 5 commissioners since the time that we started in Baltimore. The key for us was we knew that we couldn't do it without the participation or the buy-in from law enforcement. We think about the community violence intervention ecosystem. When we talk about community, well, law enforcement is a part of the community. What we want is law enforcement to come in and do their jobs in the community in a way that community can appreciate and support. So what we've managed to do was to be able to find partners within law enforcement that we could really form strong relationships with. It was just like no different than when we relentless with our young people. We're relentless with law enforcement. Some would even call it legal stalking, because we don't stop until we can get to the table and really figure out how do we make the community safe. Collaboration with law enforcement is key for a couple of different things. One, it's key for the safety of young people, because if they're in contact with young people every day and they trust us as partners to be able to work with the young people that they come in contact with, a lot of times it prevents that young person from getting involved in the system any further at that point. 2, it's about safety. safety for staff as well as safety for young people. If we know that an incident is happening in a particular area and we can, law enforcement can tell us, hey, look, it's dangerous in that area right now. You may not need to send your guys out there. Then we can have that real-time communication that really impacts safety. One of the most tragic things about the field over the past couple of years is that we've been suffering a lot of deaths of the workers who've actually been doing the work. So the collaboration between the workforce and law enforcement is becoming more and more critical if we really want to keep safety at the forefront.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. In terms of gun violence deaths, 2023 is on track to be the most deadliest year on record. Yesterday, we surpassed 600 mass shootings for the year. Guns are killing far too many people. In the same period, deaths by car accidents have been cut almost in half. Firearm deaths among children have increased by 87%. America has taken action to make cars safer, but has seemingly accepted that gun violence is a part of everyday life. The federal government has effectively regulated cars to improve public safety, but this hasn't extended that to gun violence. In fact, in the 1960s, when there was a struggle to make seatbelts a requirement, the auto industry fought that, just as the gun violence industry is fighting common sense gun reform. Hopefully, in the future, hopefully it's just my kids and not my grandkids, but hopefully my kids will look back at this struggle for universal background checks and see it just as seatbelts, a normal thing in life. Ms. Sampson, how do we overcome the barriers that have prevented us from passing regulations to decrease gun deaths?
And you can answer that, Ms. Sampson, then we're going to move to Ms. Norton. Yep.
Thank you for that question, because I think that there are many things we can do. One of them is what we're doing right here, which is to continue to talk about the problem and talk about it in a multifaceted way, because despite what the gun lobby tries to make people think, gun violence prevention laws are wildly popular with the American people. We see bipartisan support from Republicans, we see it from Democrats, we see it from gun owners and non-gun owners. But what we really need to do is continue to keep the pace up of talking about what it looks like. I think another thing we need to do is talk about democracy and making sure that American voters' policy preferences are actually able to be reflected. And one of the things that we've seen come up over and over again is that things like the filibuster or dark money in elections allow for American voters' preferences to be eclipsed by the gun lobby. So I think that's definitely something that we need to discuss. And then third, I think Mariah talked about it, which is continuing to push and put this at the forefront of electoral politics for voters to be able to make their preferences heard, not treat gun violence like a third rail, but to instead put it at the forefront of everything that we do and talk about, because I've had an opportunity to talk in different states and talk to different types of Americans, and the idea that gun violence prevention is divisive is wildly overstated. Americans are fed up. I've seen people talk about the fact that they are conservative gun owners, but they are sick and tired of the inaction. So I think we need to just continue to put this on the agenda.
Thank you very much. Ms. Norton, you're now recognized for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Chairman Raskin, I am particularly grateful for this roundtable because this topic is particularly important for us in the District of Columbia, since Congress regularly meddles into our gun laws. I would note that the House Fiscal Year 2024 Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill would permit an individual with a license to carry a concealed handgun issued by a state or territory to carry a concealed handgun in the District of Columbia or on Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority property, notwithstanding the concealed carry laws of D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. I was pleased to be joined by Ranking Member Raskin and Representative Ivey in filing an amendment to remove this provision. Ms. Sampson, can you tell me what the impact may be of allowing a person with a license from a state or territory, or any state to carry a concealed handgun in the District of Columbia?
Thank you for that question. We know based on research that when there are more guns in public places, it leads to more crime. So allowing more and more people to be walking around the streets with firearms ready to use them against people will result in more gun violence, especially on places like public transportation where people are in close proximity, where people may be stressed out. So this is a law that, from a public health perspective, would be really, really harmful to the American people.
Thank you. Ms. Kefford, in 2015 and 2017, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida introduced a bill that would eliminate most of D.C.'s local gun laws, including its ban on assault weapons and large capacity magazines. I know that you became principal of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shortly after the horrific shooting at that school. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death among children and teenagers. Can you speak to the long-term impact of gun violence to your school and community?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. The impacts are so far-reaching and long-lasting. It's been almost 6 years since our tragedy, and every subsequent mass shooting elicits panic, fear, and trauma in our community. I see teachers who have to leave, who cannot continue teaching.
Start with a word about the effect of the Hamas attack on our Israeli brothers, Jewish brothers and sisters, and non-Jewish brothers and sisters, some of whom also suffered in that attack. Most Jews and almost all Israelis know someone who's been taken as a hostage, or they know someone who was killed. So for them, this issue is not an issue that's somehow a conceptual issue. It's a live issue about a live human being that they care about and love. And I must say that even for myself, who hasn't been to Israel for several years now, I know in my friendship circle here in the United States, I have friends whose loved ones have been taken.
Basis. The need for mental health resources in schools is absolutely critical. Making sure you have that in place to support your students and your staff is imperative to a healthy school environment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Norton. And now I'll yield to Mr. Kassar from Texas for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I really appreciate the Oversight Committee hosting today's hearing, because we've had 35,000 people killed by gun violence this year alone. And instead of having hearings on critical issues like this, we've unfortunately been often pushed into hearings about Twitter or about the DC City Council instead of about how do we prevent the deaths of hundreds of children by passing common sense gun safety legislation. My district in the heart of Texas is a very short drive from Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, where we're still mourning 19 children, 2 teachers, and a whole community devastated by the killing there by a horrible shooter with an assault weapon and a weapon of war. And bulletproof doors and giving guns to teachers cannot be the solution because we've seen from the data that has not solved the problem. We need to reinstate the assault weapons ban. We need to raise the age for buy a gun. We need those universal background checks. And even though after the killings in Uvalde and in Texas and across the country, Democrats in Congress came together to pass important legislation, so much of that legislation would not have prevented what happened in Uvalde. And in my time here in Congress, I've seen that the money, the corporate gun lobby has been what has held so much of this legislation back. One estimate shows that the NRA has donated more than $140 million to corporate gun lobby candidates since 2010. And we need to continue to have that conversation so that the American people can finally push this Congress to overcome that sort of money, because if a shooter is determined to hurt innocent people and they're a dangerous person, and we continue to have these guns anywhere for everybody all the time without a license, open carried in places like Texas, we know that the killing is only going to get worse. And so I so appreciate the Oversight Democrats hosting this roundtable and each of you for your testimony and advocacy. Ms. Kefford, I just can't imagine the continued pain in your community and after what it is that students and teachers and community members experience that. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, can you tell us what you think? You know, oftentimes we hear from politicians that giving teachers guns would have stopped mass shootings. Do you think that would have stopped the mass shooting from occurring at your school?
I don't think giving more people guns would have stopped that shooting. Certainly, police responded to that tragedy, that horrible tragedy, with their weapons. Unfortunately, lives were already lost. There is a need for mental health resources. There is a need for people in schools. Almost every child in this country goes to school, right? Who sees those children more than probably their parents do, their teachers, staff at schools. Having resources in place for early warning signs, for identifying when there's an issue, for providing that support is absolutely critical. Not always is it going to solve the problem to have those resources in place after. We need to have those resources all along, right? Before tragedies and after tragedies. And I think making sure that there is funding for that in place is absolutely 100% critical. I also think from a safety perspective, having a trained school resource officer who has specific training and experience working with adolescents, working in schools is critical to, number one, foster that relationship and ensure that there's safety in that school. Mr. Timpson spoke about that just a few minutes ago, about that relationship piece and having that exposure of young people to law enforcement and how important bridging that relationship is.
Thank you. And Professor Blocher, when the Second Amendment was drafted, do you think the Founding Fathers anticipated tens of thousands of innocent Americans being killed by gun violence every year?
I'm quite confident they did not. I'm also confident that the guns with which they were familiar were black powder muskets, which, having fired one, I can tell you takes about a minute to load and frequently misfires. There's no possible way they could have conceived of a situation like what transpired at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, or for that matter in Lewiston, or for that matter at any of the other place names, which we all know, unfortunately, all too well.
I appreciate the clarity of your remarks. I appreciate us bringing folks together to have oversight on this critical issue. Look at how it is we can save thousands of lives every year and have oversight over the corporate gun lobby and the amount of money that they put into the system that keeps us from taking on reasonable solutions that are constitutional, that are up to date, and that are just the baseline response to the gun violence, both mass shootings and everyday killings that we see in our community. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Cassar, and yield now to our colleague from New York, Congressman Goldman, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Raskin. Thank you for your leadership and for convening this hearing. Thanks to my two colleagues from Florida who also helped to organize it. Thank you all for being here. I agree with Ms. Sampson. The more that we get together in a room, whether it's public or private, and are talking about this, the better. I come from this issue as a former prosecutor of 10 years, and so I have that perspective has informed a lot of where I look at things, in addition to previously being involved with criminal justice reform movement. And so much of what you all are talking about, whether it be community violence interrupters or community engagement, better community-oriented policing, I think can and will make such a big difference. And there are a couple other ideas I wanted to throw by you, but the first question I would love to get your views on is when I talk to, I'm from New York City, but when I talk to sort of rural Democrats in New York, they say that part of the reason they are bleeding Democrats in those rural communities is they believe that Democrats are trying to take their guns away. and that is, for them, that's way too far, and that as much as we might talk about gun safety, common sense legislation, all of these bills that we're talking about, of course, are not taking their guns away, but that's the way they perceive it. And part of it, therefore, seems to me to be a little bit of a messaging issue. And I'm curious, I'll throw this open to any of you who want to answer it, but I'm curious what you all have seen to be the most effective and least effective ways of talking broadly about what we call gun violence prevention legislation or gun safety legislation in a way that does not scare people who might just want to own, a small handgun, which they probably should be able to do.
I can start with an answer on that. One of the things that I think is really important to, a lesson that's important to take away from the history and tradition of gun regulation in the United States is exactly the urban-rural distinction that you're talking about. There are some kinds of laws that in order to be effective need to be done at either the federal or the state level. Background checks, I think, are a good example of that. But there are a lot of other laws that actually can be tailored locally that might actually, in a way, capture some of the concerns that rural constituents might have. If you look back in throughout American history, for example, some of the famous supposed gun havens, the Tombstone, Arizonas, and the Dodge City, Kansases, they had gun prohibitions today that are well outside of our political, what we imagine as being politically possible. You could not carry your handgun into one of those cities. You had to check it at the city limits, which to me signals that there may be a difference. There may be some room, at least for some kinds of laws to be tailored. Now others, the prohibition on possession by people subject to domestic violence restraining orders, those must be nationwide in order to function. But there actually may be some room sort of in the joints, and the fact that it's traditional, I think at least for some people, may quell some concerns.
Ms. Sampson? That's a great point. And Ms. Covert, I'm going to spare you just because I'm going to see you in a week with my colleague, Congressman Moskowitz, to get a tour. But I want to talk to Mr. Timpson and Ms. Cooley for a minute, if I could, about some of the alternative ways of tackling this issue, which I think dovetails very much into just crime generally. The thing that jumps out to me, and I'm curious what you all would think, is that at least in New York, the NYPD's time is so much of it is spent on either domestic disputes or homelessness, neither of which a police officer is trained to deal with. And I keep coming back to the idea of we need someone to keep the peace, to keep things safe, but we really need mental health professionals to address the particular problems of those people, which would then free up law enforcement officers to become much more engaged in the communities. Curious just what you all think would be, a couple of other steps that you would suggest to allow. It doesn't even require more funding for police officers. It might need more funding for mental health professionals. But what are different ways that you have seen or imagined to be successful in getting to the root cause of a lot of these issues? I'll start with you, Mr. Timpson.
Yeah, we have more community resources readily available. A lot of people have to travel too far out of their communities to get resources like mental health. And then when you have cross-training, like not only do we do our Rewire 4 for our community and our workers, but we also, our Rewire CBT for our community and our workers, we also do an amended version, Rewire 4, for police officers. Because what we understand about the community in general is that everybody's traumatized, whether it be the police officer who's constantly dealing with the problems or the person who's constantly in contact with law enforcement because of their behavior. So everybody's traumatized. So at the bottom of it, at the end of the day, how do we help heal, again, community trauma? That means the trauma of everybody who services or works or lives in that community. So really it's about more resources, more appropriate resources, and more readily available resources. I know some places they have social workers that go out with police officers, or they have, people who have built some trauma recovery centers in certain communities where people can go receive any type of service that they need that's trauma related. So again, I think that those services being readily available and or looking at alternative ways to have community work with law enforcement on those types of things really make a difference.
And then just to add on to that, I couldn't agree more with everything that you said. But also, when looking at crime and gun violence prevention, we have to see it in a holistic approach, right? That means what kind of schools are these children going to? What kind of teaching are they receiving? Do we have teachers who care about the students, especially in Black and brown communities? I grew up in one of the most segregated school districts in the country, and I could tell the vast difference from the program I was allowed to and the education I received, rather the area in which my zip code was actually from. And I probably wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the program I was involved in. So education is something that's so important. Also looking at food deserts. Do people have access to proper foods to nourish their bodies? Do people have food on the table? Is there access to jobs? When people don't have access to those basic needs, then they result to crime. And so I think something that CVI does a great job with, and community violence prevention as a whole, is we're investing in all of those programs. I did work with youth over the summer where I would help students find jobs over the summer, because that's oftentimes when youth would be involved in crime, is when they're not in school. So you have to give them alternative solutions to know that they can come out of the situation they may have been born into and surpass their goals beyond any means their community has ever seen. But that really means addressing it in all aspects, from mental health to education to food, everything.
Well, you stole my next question, which is good because I'm about out of time. But I was going to address the education. And one thing I would just add to the idea box here is alternative education, apprenticeships, vocational education. And because at least from my experience, when I was a federal prosecutor, when the rap sheet would get to me, it was long, and there were minor offenses at early ages that if we could have had much more upfront resources and diversion programs, these people would not have ended up in a federal court. And I continue to think that math and English may not be for everybody, and we need to tackle our education system. That is a massive, massive undertaking. But it still may not be for everyone, but there can be alternative pathways that can lead to a really meaningful, successful middle-class life, union jobs, whatever it may be, that we might want to start to try to put a little bit. And maybe, Ms. Kefford, you want to finish up before I turn it back?
I'm chomping at the bit over here. I couldn't agree more with what you said, and you just made an amazing point that's so critical with education funding. These resources need to be put in place in schools, and money does not need to be cut from the budget for schools, because this is where we can service these children before they go down that pathway. So providing those resources for early detection, for mental health, for all of these things that are so critical to a child's overarching development, it just can't be understated how important the funding is. So I just wanted to make mention of that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. And now I'm going to do my questions, beginning with you, Mrs. Kefford. Tell us about the nature of some of the different school districts that have gotten involved in your network of principals recovering from gun violence. And then the second part of my question is, what are some of the long-term consequences of going through the kinds of gun violence that your school districts have experienced?
Thank you for the question. So to speak to the PRN, the Principal Recovery Network, we have principals from all over the country, an amazing group of educators who have suffered all different levels of trauma, from people being shot themselves to schools like mine where there was a mass shooting and that took the lives unnecessarily of 17 innocent victims. So we come together with different perspectives, different experiences, and use our collective shared experiences to help guide other educators who find themselves in this horrific situation. The road to recovery is long. As I stated before, everybody's needs are a little bit different. Really, when your school and your community undergoes something as horrific as we've had to endure, any of my colleagues in the Principal Recovery Network have had to endure, you have always that heightened sense of fear. Anytime anything happens, it re-traumatizes our community, our students, our staff. So we have to be especially cognizant of those needs and make sure that we have resources to meet those needs and to serve those needs. We continue, like I shared with you a few weeks ago, there was another mass shooting, and of course that re-traumatized, our staff. And you have to just be sure that you have the resources in place to meet their needs and to help them recover and continue their journey of recovery.
Yeah, and just finally on that, I take it that you want to see the resources there because the violence is there and these episodes are taking place all over the country, but presumably that's not in conflict with your group and fellow educators demanding an end to the kind of gun violence we're seeing, right?
We definitely want to end gun violence without question, but we also live in a world, unfortunately, where this continues to occur. So we want to make sure that, unfortunately, if something does occur, there are resources in place to address it effectively and to help those who are impacted heal.
Yeah, and Mr. Simpson, I wanted to ask you the same question. You're very much on the ground with young people trying to intervene to stop gun violence as you see these cycles spinning out of control. And so you're very much in the middle of this crisis, but you also presumably envision a day when we can get out of it, right? I mean, you'd like to put yourself out of work, presumably, right?
I would love to.
Yeah.
I always tell my young people, I wait for the day where you put me out of work, right? Where you make me go find another field. Yeah. And the hope is there, but again, we have to focus on the long term.
Yeah.
Because it's not a short-term fix. We can address things in the short term, but it's about what do we do to address the long-term damage that's been done to a lot of our young people.
Yeah. Professor Blocher, in the District of Columbia versus Heller decision, the conservative majority on the court in a 5-4 ruling determined that the Second Amendment right is an individual right to possess a firearm, at least for the purposes of hunting and recreation and self-defense. It was not a collective right tethered to service in the well-regulated militia. And I think that a lot of people concerned about the gun violence crisis took solace in the fact that, well, at the very least, Chief Justice Scalia, wrote the opinion, and the other conservatives said that still the Congress, the states, the localities could pass reasonable gun safety regulation. There was nothing in that individual right that was somehow absolute. Now, my colleagues, as I was saying, in Congress are asserting it's absolute because the Second Amendment is really about the right to overthrow the government. My first question for you is, do you agree with me that there's nothing in Supreme Court precedent or the architecture of the Constitution that supports this idea that the meaning of the Second Amendment is to give the people the right to overthrow the government? But then secondly, where is the Supreme Court headed with this Bruin doctrine, reading the Second Amendment right through the prism of historical tradition?
So to take those questions in order on the insurrectionary theory, and this goes back to your opening remarks, I think the idea that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to violently overthrow a democratic government is not just wrong and dangerous. It's an effort to graft some kind of natural law or political philosophy into the Constitution, but it is profoundly ahistorical, unconstitutional, and frankly anti-democratic. On the ahistorical point, as you mentioned this in your opening remarks, the framers had experience with armed rebellions, including the Shays Rebellion, which was before the Constitution was ratified. The Whiskey Rebellion after the Constitution was ratified, they didn't celebrate those. They squashed those rebellions. They were not taken to be the content of the Second Amendment right. I say anti-constitutional or unconstitutional because, as we saw earlier, the Constitution itself, at least half a dozen places, refers to things like in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, giving Congress the power to call out the militias to suppress rebellions. Article 4, Section 4, which refers to domestic violence as a threat to a Republican form of government. Article 3, as you mentioned earlier, defines treason, the only constitutionally specified crime, essentially capturing what the insurrectionary theorists are trying to celebrate. These are all in the teeth of the very text of the Constitution. And the third, I say it's an anti-democratic approach precisely because the anti-insurrectionary or the insurrectionary view brings with it a form of tyranny. What we saw in, for example, Michigan in the spring of 2020, when an armed group took over the Michigan legislature, the Michigan State House, was that the legislature ended its session early. That is, armed individuals short-circuited an institution of democracy, which is pretty close to the basic definition of tyranny. And what that shows, I think, is guns warping the public sphere in ways, even if a person is not shot or killed. I think Ms. Keffert's comments earlier captured this well. Even those not directly injured by a gun can nonetheless be traumatized or hurt by it. And frankly, we form governments and constitutions to avoid those kinds of things, not to protect them. And if a constitutional democracy doesn't act to control the use of guns, then the use of guns will act to control the limits of a constitutional democracy. On your second question about where the Supreme Court is headed, I think based on the oral argument in Bruin, I expect the domestic violence restraining order law to be upheld. That is, I expect the justices to overturn the Fifth Circuit's decision, but I don't expect them to walk back, at least explicitly, the historical test they announced in Bruin, which means I think we should expect to see some continuing incoherence and division in the lower courts with regard to the kinds of gun laws that really do matter for keeping Americans safe.
Yeah, and final two questions. Ms. Sampson, I remember when it was thought that abortion rights was a losing issue for liberals, and then after the Supreme Court revoked Roe versus Wade and women's right to choose, voters all over the country, from Kansas to Ohio to Michigan, have been making very clear this is a pro-choice country. And I'm wondering whether you're either seeing or anticipating the same kind of electoral rebellion against the tyranny of the gun industry and the gun lobby.
Thanks for that question, because I think it's we are. But I think the ways that we're seeing it show why it's so important for federal action. Because when you look at the states, they have been passing so many different types of gun laws in a bipartisan manner. So we've seen increasing passage of ERPO bills. We've seen increasing passage of high-capacity and assault weapons bans in the states, just as one example. Same thing with universal background checks. And part of the reason why is because the states don't necessarily suffer from the same anti-democratic policies as Congress, especially the Senate. And so I think the will is there for the American people. And if you were to be able to just have a direct vote, I think you would see different outcomes. And that's why it's so important that your colleagues in the House allow these bills to be brought up for a vote, and your colleagues in the Senate to also allow bills to be brought up for a straight vote. Because when you have that, the will of the American people is very clear that they want universal background checks, that they want ATF to be able to have funding to do its job, and so forth.
Wonderful. Well, Ms. Cooley, I'm going to give you the last word. I know you're a recent college graduate from Howard, and I know it's also a tough time to be a young person. I think our Surgeon General has declared there to be a nationwide emotional and mental health crisis. Some of that undoubtedly relates to the gun violence epidemic in the country. Some of it relates to climate change and polarization, and there's certainly enough bad news out there. I'm wondering whether you think that the massacres we see and the continuing daily death toll that we see around gun violence is something that is demoralizing and depressing young people and making it harder for them to get politically engaged? Or do you think it is something that at least potentially can inspire people to get involved in political action to turn things around?
Definitely. I think it's something that is kind of in twofold, right? Especially with, the unjust killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Thousands and thousands of young people, including myself, took that and organized within our hometowns to speak up for what we thought was right. But then it comes the burnout. We're still students. We still have to go to school in the middle of a pandemic, mind you. So it's something that as young activists, as organizers, that when you're working with these organizations or you're working with these smaller groups, you have to take a step away for your mental health because we're still so young, and everyone in the movement should take the time they need. But I think that as depressing as the losses are and as gut-wrenching as they are every time, it's something that continues to mobilize Gen Z to go out and vote in record numbers in the midterms in 2018, in the midterms in 2022, in the 2020 general election, and up until, next year in 2024. Youth have consistently showed up to vote. We are the ones organizing. We are doing phone banks. I spent all of the last 3 months of 2020 organizing on the phone, text banks, phone banks, fighting for representatives that I knew wanted to save my life, because although I may not be old enough to be in these elected positions yet, I'm going to do everything I can to put those of age in power. And that's how you see folks like Congressman Maxwell Frost. He's been working with March for Our Lives for years. I've worked with him for years, and now seeing him in office is what inspires Gen Z to keep showing up in the polls.
I want to thank you. I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists for very insightful and lucid presentations today that give me a lot of hope that we'll be able to move forward. The reason this was a roundtable and not a hearing, of course, is that the oversight Democrats are in the minority, and we could not convince the majority to have a hearing about the state of the nation with respect to gun violence and what can be done to move things forward. We found it important and pressing enough that we figured we would go ahead and do our own roundtable discussion. And we want to thank all of you for participating in it. I hope that it's going to spur action all over the country, and it certainly inspires us to keep trying to move forward here and to build the majorities for gun safety in the country that we know are out there in Congress too. So thank you all for coming, and I hope we can live up to the title of our roundtable today, not just thoughts and prayers, but action and change, and thank you all for coming.